Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Hello and welcome to episode 94 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. The curtain rises on the steps of the royal house of Thebes in ancient Greece. A procession of priests, representatives of the people, have come to appeal to their king, Oedipus, to help them cure the city of a terrible plague that has overwhelmed it, just as he had solved the riddle of the Sphinx years before and earned himself the throne. But despite his exceptional courage and intelligence, or perhaps because of this very heroism, Oedipus will not be able to appease the gods that have brought the scourge upon Thebes without destroying himself and his family. Unbeknownst to him, he has already fulfilled the terrible prophecy that he would kill his father and marry his mother, the truth of which now poisons the city. His anguished journey of self-discovery ends with his sacrificing himself to purge the moral plague. This is Sophocles' enduring Greek tragedy, Oedipus the King, made more familiar to us, of course, by the psychological principle that Freud coined from the myth. Written nearly 2,500 years ago, it has endured not only because of the dramatic trauma of Oedipus' personal story, his battle between his fate and his free will, but also as an allegory of authoritarian political power set against established beliefs and the voices of democracy. It has proved remarkably adaptable to modern social and political times, which is attested by the fact that not one, but two major productions of the play have been staged in London this year. The first being Robert Icke's clever updating, which recast Oedipus as a populist contemporary politician and featured electrifying performances by Mark Strong and Leslie Manville as the doomed couple. This was followed by playwright Ella Hickson's adaptation at the Old Vic Theatre with Rami Malek and Indira Varma, which conceived the plague as an environmental catastrophe and pitted Oedipus and Jocasta against the reactionary powers of established religion. I'm delighted to be able to talk about Sophocles' classic with a true expert on Greek tragedy, Edith Hall. Edith is professor in the Department of Classics and Ancient History at Durham University. Prior to this, she was professor in classics at King's College in London and at Royal Holloway, University of London. She's also a broadcaster and writer, the author of part or the whole of no fewer than 30 books, including Introducing the Ancient Greeks and Greek Tragedy Suffering Under the Sun. And for our purposes today, she edited and introduced the Oxford World Classic edition of 3 of Sophocles' tragedies, including Oedipus the King. Loyal listeners will remember that Edith joined me way back in episode 25 when we covered Euripides' tragedy Medea. I'm honored that she's accepted my invitation to return as our resident Greek expert. Hi, Edith. Thanks for coming back for more.
Hello, I'm thrilled to be here.
Great. So, Edith, it must warm your heart to see Sophocles flourishing on the London stage in 2025. What is it about Greek tragedy that makes it so enduring, and why do you think it seems to speak to us now?
There are so many ways to answer that.
We have an hour.
These plays are about very primal human situations, huge emotions. They're about intimate family relationships, parent and child in particular, husband and wife too, but mainly the parent-child relationship. They are stripped, unlike ancient Greek comedy, of any contemporary allusions that lock them into the 5th century before our era. They don't refer to contemporary politicians or contemporary anything. They're already set. When Sophocles composed the Oedipus, he's already setting it in a timeless mythical era several centuries before him and his audience. That's a bit like if we would write a play that was set in like Arthurian England. So they're already set in a timeless zone for them. And so it's not a problem at all identifying this era. I think that they're not too long. This is not like a 5-act Shakespearean tragedy. They last less than 2 hours. And they have a very strong interest in things that really matter to us today, like gender, relationships between men and women, and the problems that tyrannical governments, that is, governments that are not democratic, how leaders abuse their power, and they have choruses that represent the community, that the audiences can really identify with being the little people through. Add to that they're full of some of the most magnificent poetry in world literature that is so good that it absolutely withstands translation. It's like you can put Shakespeare on in German and it still works because of the power of the imagery. So is that enough answers to get us going?
Yeah, you've done a great job. Yeah, it's interesting that you're saying that the setting isn't so specific, though it makes it universal and adaptable.
Yeah.
And there are all these personal stories, you say, full of big emotions, but also political ones as well. We've got here a play about leadership, challenges and corruption in the body politic, or something to that effect, a leader under pressure with a pandemic.
I also think that the fact that the religion in them, so this is the Olympian religion in the Oedipus, the god that really counts is Apollo. I think that that means that they're actually strangely more accessible in a religious way because nobody believes in the Olympian religion. So you can sit with a Muslim, a Hindu, a Sikh, a Confucian, and a Christian and a Jew, and you can all suspend that because it's not your religion and enjoy it together, that this is just power of God and fate.
No one's offended then, in some way.
It becomes strangely secular.
Yeah. Although it's interesting, we'll talk a little bit about how religion may play in this play. Can you tell us a little bit more before we get stuck into this play about who Sophocles was? He was a bit of a superstar in his own time, wasn't he?
Well, he was really the only one of the three great ancient Athenian tragedians. The other two are Aeschylus and Euripides. The only one that everybody said great things about even while he was alive. He seems to have been an incredibly popular person in the city and he had no enemies and everybody liked him. He was affable, apparently, which given how dark his tragedies are. One of the reasons we know that everybody rated him is that he was twice put into high public office. The other two Athenian tragedians did not have public political careers. In midlife, he was elected one of the 10 generals. Now, the generals weren't just responsible for military affairs. They were responsible for military affairs, but they were also responsible for everything that we would see as a president or a prime minister. But I think that also gives us a clue as to why his plays are so politically powerful. This is a guy who has had power. He's thought about the responsibility of being in charge. But of course, he's in a democracy, which means he can get booted out. There, it was only a year. They didn't get any 4-year term. They only got a year. So he knows exactly what it's like, both to be a citizen with other guys on top and to be one of the guys in charge.
But he made his name as a playwright, right? He was a bit of a superstar in the world of drama in Athens, yes?
He was, and he seems to have been destined to it almost from childhood. His family wasn't a theatre family. His father owned a very prosperous arms factory, actually. They were rich. They were from a noble line. But he apparently excelled at what they called music, which actually meant everything to do with the muses. So poetry, dancing, choral singing. He started out as an actor. And we know, in fact, of 2 plays in which he did star, but his voice didn't carry enough as he developed into manhood. It wasn't loud enough. So, mercifully for us, he decided to try his hand at actually writing this stuff and was incredibly successful from day one. He frequently won the drama competitions. These plays were put on in competitions annually where 3 playwrights were chosen by the state to compete against each other, and he repeatedly won. The judges were democratically selected by lot to avoid corruption. So you or I could have been picked. But if they went against the clapping, I mean, they couldn't. They had to go with the applause because they'd probably been lynched.
Yes, but he won more times than anyone else.
Absolutely.
So is there a way to generalize what distinguishes Sophocles' work and how does it compare to the other tragedians of his time?
Yes, there are ways, partly because we're fortunate that the great philosopher Aristotle, in his treatise on tragedy, the Poetics, told us what they thought were the differences. And do you know what the main one is? It's that Sophocles' characters are all actually trying to do their best. He's not interested in very evil people. He wants to show not perfect people, but people who are trying to make good decisions. They make mistakes. As Aristotle says, that's why we feel for them, because they're people like you or I. Euripides was really interested in the nature of evil.
Yes.
We talked about that a bit in the Medea podcast. How can we possibly sympathize, which we actually do, with somebody who does such terrible things as Medea? Aeschylus is also interested in very problematic people. So we've got this moral elevation. He also, in terms of his style, that's the other big thing, was renowned for what was called his plain speech. So Aeschylus loves incredibly ornate, picturesque, obscure, high poetic language, to the extent that some ancient Greeks said he was incomprehensible sometimes.
Okay.
It sounded gorgeous, but you didn't always know what he was going on about. Euripides was very influenced by the contemporary passion for learning rhetoric. So really big debate scenes where you're really interested in the structure of the argumentation and the witticism. We have again had that in Medea with the big debate between Jason and Medea. Sophocles' characters, although they speak beautiful verse, were famous for their plain words. It's very direct. It's very pure style.
So it makes it more accessible, does it?
It does. It certainly makes it deeply clear. He wants you to think about the content, if you like, rather than the vehicle. So it focuses harder on the issues than on the dramatic effect.
So I'd also read somewhere that in formal terms, is this right, that he was innovative in adding a third actor. Now, it doesn't sound like that's very many actors, but is that something significant in the form of Greek tragedy, which was usually just two people on the stage? Is that right?
Well, no, it isn't, because Euripides followed suit very quickly.
Okay.
But Aeschylean tragedy only needs two actors until right at the end of his career in the Oresteia, when he was copying early Sophocles as well. And even then, you don't get big triangular scenes with three equally loaded parts. Now, this was a brilliant innovation. It's very interesting that they didn't go beyond three. And that's because if you're listening to a story, it's actually been proven by modern cognitive psychologists, it's really hard to follow plots with more than three people if you're listening to it, holding in your head where they are. So they don't go over three. They went in and changed masks so that three actors could sustain a play with like 9 parts. It's about three being on stage at the same time. Now, we see several scenes in Sophocles where the use of the third actor adds immeasurably to the dramatic power. In the Oedipus, that scene is where Jocasta twigs. She twigs before Oedipus does.
Yes.
Oedipus is talking to the shepherd, but all our eyes are on her.
Yes, because of her reaction.
We're listening with her. She becomes another audience member. So that's the kind of incredible use of three. There's an earlier scene when Oedipus is having a terrible quarrel with his brother-in-law, Creon. These two men are having this big altercation, and she comes out and says, boys, basically, boys, behave yourselves. So you've got the two warring men and this very dignified woman who actually, at that point, feels a lot more mature than either of them.
You reminded me that the conventions of Greek performance were that it was very ceremonial. The actors were wearing masks, but to distinguish the characters, the masks could be obviously a different color, paler for women than men, and also facial hair and that sort of thing. And that only 3 actors could do multiple parts in that way. Where in Sophocles' career and life does this play, Oedipus the King, come?
We don't actually have a date for this play. It's usually thought to have been put on in around 430 or 428 BCE. The reasons for that aren't particularly good. That's because it's got a plague in it. And Athens had a terrible plague just after the Peloponnesian War started in 431. So a lot of people think that maybe Sophocles is responding to that. I have problems with that because the Iliad, the greatest Greek poem of them all, begins with a plague. Beginning with a plague was a literary convention. But I do think it's almost certainly the product of Sophocles' maturity, So I think that that's a very plausible kind of date for it.
And it's part of something called the Theban Plays, but that's a sort of loose collection, right?
Well, it's not only loose, it's misleading. They're quite often, these three plays about the Theban royal family, put on as a trilogy, one after the other. And if you do that, then Oedipus is the first. Then it's followed by a play called Oedipus at Colonus, where Oedipus has been driven out of Thebes after the discovery, comes to Athens where he dies. And that is followed in mythical time by his very famous Antigone, where he's long dead, but his sons go to war with each other over the kingship of Thebes. And his daughter Antigone gets into terrible trouble by burying the body of the attacking brother, Polynices, contrary to the edict of the now ruler, Creon. But there are discrepancies between the three in terms of details of the plot, and they were certainly not put on together. We know the date of Oedipus at Colonus because it was put on after Sophocles' death right at the end of the 5th century. It's posthumous. We don't know the date of Antigone, but there are good enough reasons for thinking that was in around 441.
Yes, it preceded Oedipus the King. So they don't come in the chronological order.
No, but having said that, if you're playing to an audience who's seen you earlier do a play in which Oedipus figured, and all the Athenians loved the theatre, they all went, if you had seen Oedipus the Tyrant, the one we're talking about today, variously called Oedipus the King or Oedipus the Tyrant, depending on how you translate the ancient Greek, Tyrannos, if you'd seen that, you will remember the relationship between Oedipus and Creon. He actually didn't change their personalities at all.
So that was consistent. So what about the source of the Oedipus story? Because you mentioned earlier that these plays are generally written about times past, and that actually the story of Oedipus would have been known to the Athenian audience. The story exists. Where does the story come from?
The story is as old as Homer. There were other epic poems than the Iliad and the Odyssey about the late Bronze Age that we have very sadly lost, including a whole cycle about Thebes. So the Iliad and the Odyssey belong to a whole cycle about the Trojan War. This cycle was nothing to do with international war. It was about the civil war in the city of Thebes. Not only did Sophocles' audience know that epic, but Aeschylus, his predecessor, had written a whole trilogy of tragedies about this family. So what you did with something like that was you couldn't change the absolute bare bones of sex and death. So who marries who has what child? Those are really basic things, could not be altered, or if you're cursed by God. But you could change all the details of how that got worked out, when everything happened, how minor characters or lesser characters reacted. You could choose who to bring on stage. And crucially, you could choose who to have as your chorus. There is no chorus in epic. So when Oedipus comes into Sophocles' mind, I'm going to write a story about the day he found out. He could have chosen a chorus of very old men. He could have chosen a chorus of maidens complaining that they were barren because of the play. He chose to make it a chorus of apparently men the same sort of age as Oedipus who are his citizens. That is who he chose. And that is for a reason, because if there's a problem with your monarch, it doesn't just affect his personal life, it directly affects the safety of the city-state.
So people are familiar with the bones of the story, but then he decides what the dramatic shape of this is going to be, what he's going to focus on. Can we just tell listeners what happens in this play? They may know the premise of Oedipus, as we said at the beginning, but can you give us a very brief summary of the events as they're told in Oedipus the King?
I will. And the important thing is that Sophocles had to figure out a way, because the convention, very powerful one, called the unity of time, which is to set all the events in an unfolding hour and a half in kind of real time. You need in that to explain all the antecedents and at least look to the consequences. He famously, it's another Sophoclean feature, rather than giving you a long rambling prologue at the beginning by somebody saying, this is the backstory, likes to plunge you directly into the action. So it opens and we've got Oedipus addressing a chorus of priests and extremely unwell citizens who have come in despair to the palace to say, you have to do something. We are dying. Our children are dying. We're not going to have any food. Our crops are blighted. You are our monarch. And then they say, you saved us once before when you arrived here. We were beset by this monstrous Sphinx. You saved us before. Do it again. And he says, he calls them children. It's very paternalist. He says, my children, I am going spare with anxiety. I'm lying awake at night and I have already started. I've sent my brother-in-law Creon to the Delphic oracle, the fountain of all truth and knowledge, because Apollo never lies, to find out what's going on. So that's how it starts.
Creon has gone to the Delphic oracle and has come back with the news that the plague is being caused because someone who killed the previous king, Laius, has not been punished.
The murderer is in the city. Yes.
The murderer is in the city, and for that, the gods are punishing Thebes in some moral sense.
So Oedipus curses this murderer and says that he will find him, and tells everybody that if they know anything, they're going to be really punished. He is going to find them out. And it shows himself not to be just paranoid, but a bit obsessive at this point, that he will not sleep until the murderer is discovered.
But he thinks he's acting in the best interest of the city, right? This needs to be solved.
Totally. He takes actually extremely admirable, swift action to try to find the person who is causing the plague. But of course, he doesn't know that that person is himself.
Yes.
He then has a terrible row with Tiresias, the Theban prophet, and accuses him of having lied and accepting money and maybe plotting somehow or other to get rid of him and making all of this up.
Tiresias is essentially saying that he's the problem. Oedipus is the problem.
He says, you're the problem.
It would be quite hard to accept on his part, to be fair.
It senses Oedipus, and Oedipus is in danger here. He has every reason to think that he can solve everything with his brain because he did it before. He did it with the Sphinx. He solved the riddle. So he has every reason to think maybe his brain is more effective than religion. That's where he starts to get a bit hubristic. But he has every reason to do so. I mean, if you have gone through life and solved everything by your brain and become extremely successful and saved everyone, then you're going to think you can rely on that intellectual machine up there. So he has this terrible row then with Creon and accuses him of plotting with Tiresias. Jocasta comes out. And it's from that point onwards, once she comes out to calm the fighting men down and to talk to Oedipus, that he gradually starts to piece together the full horror of who he is. She tries to stop him, and we can talk about what her motives are. So Oedipus was found as a baby and adopted by the Corinthian royal family. And he was brought up there. And a shepherd arrives from Corinth to say, do not worry, Oedipus. We know the Delphic oracle said that you were going to kill your father and marry your mother, but do not worry. Your father is dead because the king of Corinth has died.
Yes, so Oedipus had left Corinth because he had heard this prophecy and feared that he might kill his own father.
And what we're actually demonstrating is how superbly tightly Sophocles is plotted, because it is a measure. The fact that Sophocles has made it completely clear as it evolves, and we are slightly struggling to get the complexity of who knows what when.
Exactly. It goes at a pace, and it all takes place within one day, even in real time, essentially. So it's got this really concentrated intensity. And the plot is fantastic. It's almost like a crime thriller, isn't it, really? Because Oedipus is acting like a detective with the terrible twist that it is himself that he's looking for. The way that he follows, as you say, rationally, he uses his intelligence and he keeps searching for evidence, interviews with the witnesses, and the way each piece of the puzzle is gradually revealed. But the other thing that's interesting about it is that we know the result, as the Athenian audience knew the result. Throughout, there is this fantastic sense of foreboding and inevitability, but we still get shocked by it. It's the ultimate in dramatic irony, though, isn't it? I mean, it's so effective, that.
It's just superb. It is outstanding. Nobody has ever invented a better plot than the detective who's looking for the murderer, and all the time it's himself. It's just wonderful. But because he has been brought up assuming that the Corinthian royal couple were his parents, even though he'd heard a rumour to the contrary, a rumour, even though he'd heard the rumour. That's a very good reason if you are genuinely sure that a guy who safely died.
Yes, and as it turns out, he's killed this chap Laius, but he didn't know it was Laius.
No.
In an altercation on the road after he'd left Corinth. And he had no idea, and still didn't, that that was Laius, and that Laius, ultimately, of course, was his father. And how he became his father is something Jocasta knows, because Jocasta, we're going back to try and explain this plot, Jocasta had a baby, and she had heard this prophecy and decided, well, the way to avoid the son killing the father is to kill the son.
Well, I don't think it was just her. I think her husband may well have pressurised her here. That's Laius. That is Oedipus's father, whom Oedipus did indeed kill. And he gets curious about this Oedipus because he does remember killing this guy on the road. And he asks Jocasta about it. He still has no idea that it was his father.
Jocasta says it was at this place where three roads meet. And he goes, that's the place where I had this altercation with these people. But Jocasta believes, because this is what she's been told, that it was a group of brigands who attacked Laius and killed him. So she thinks, no single man like Oedipus was responsible.
The reason she thinks that is that there was one witness. And I think in some ways the most important character in the entire play has no name. It's the Theban shepherd. Now, it turns out that the one witness who escaped Oedipus's road rage
yes,
was a slave of Laius, who sometimes worked as a shepherd, sometimes worked as a footman on the carriage. He witnessed it. He saw who it was. And we later discover that when he came back to Thebes and discovered Oedipus had solved the riddle of the Sphinx and become king, he asked Jocasta, he said, send me as far away to work as you can. He has known all along.
He recognizes Oedipus, of course.
Yeah. I mean, this is years ago, but there is this one guy who knew. And of course, the economy of plotting being what it is, he is also the same trusted family slave that Jocasta had given the baby to expose on the mountain.
Yes, but he didn't, as instructed, just leave the baby to die. He gave it to this other Corinthian shepherd, who then gave it to the royal family of Corinth, and that's how Oedipus ended up in Corinth.
On stage, it just works quite simply that the Corinthian shepherd turns up and says, don't worry, Polybus is dead. The Theban shepherd is finally brought. Oedipus has been ordering, saying, bring me that witness, bring me that witness. He finally comes on, and of course the two shepherds instantly know what's happened because they remember each other. At this point, Jocasta twigs.
Yeah, that's a terrible moment.
And leaves silently to kill herself. But Oedipus still hasn't twigged fully. He does not twig until he orders the Theban shepherd, who will not speak. He's so terrified. He orders the Theban shepherd to be tortured. He actually says, tie his hands behind his back. We're going to get this out. At that point, Oedipus twigs. But of course, Jocasta's already gone inside to kill herself. I love this fact that these two slaves, just like any household that has got servants in, they always know far more than people realise. Although Tiresias, the priest, has known all along, there's this one other guy who isn't even given a name because he's so low status, the shepherd from Thebes, who's been living out on the mountain for 15 years.
Staying out of Oedipus's sight.
In utter terror, knowing that this guy is Jocasta's son.
Yeah.
Ugh, makes you shiver.
We talked about the dramatic irony because everything Oedipus says is loaded with double meaning for us in the audience because we know these facts and the prophecy, and he doesn't. So, I mean, that puts us in this ironic position, of course. And that has such a power in itself, doesn't it? It's strange because we may even wish that we could change the story, somehow tell him to stop seeking the answers. But of course, that's never going to happen. It's inevitable. It is going to unfold as it's going to unfold.
It is, but what we don't know, because Sophocles was entitled to change or invent, is how Oedipus is going to react when he discovers. And there were many different versions of that, and he didn't blind himself in all of them. And in some of them, he left Thebes immediately and went into exile. What Sophocles chooses to do is have him discover the body of his wife and to have him blind himself. There are other versions where she doesn't even die. So it's how you respond to the main frame of the story that you put your stamp on it. He makes Jocasta go off in complete silence. We never hear her pain. He has a wonderful messenger speech where the messenger describes Oedipus going in. She's hanged herself, taking the brooches from her dress of her hanging corpse and stabbing his eyes out over the bed. Then he comes out, and that is all new. He could actually have said, because there's a play by Euripides that implies this did happen, that they actually say, well, this is most unfortunate, and we're going to have to retire from the throne, but let's just live together.
But we're staying together, yeah.
Yes!
Oh my
there
God.
was a version by Euripides. So Sophocles really piles on the tragedy at this point.
Oh, I mean, you're right. That messenger's speech is just the most vivid. He's racing around the palace looking for a sword to either kill himself and her, or both of them, and discovers her hanging. And then that detail of the golden brooches from her dress. Oh my God, that's just genius.
But he really, really loved her. And Sophocles makes that very, very clear, that this is a wonderful love story. So here's a lonely woman who had lost the only baby she'd ever had. She was probably married at only about 13, had this baby, lost the baby, probably then had no further sex with her husband because they were so terrified because of the oracle.
Okay, of course.
So she's unbelievably lonely. Then Oedipus turns up when she's maybe 34, 35. She's not the old woman that the actresses usually are. You know, she's full on gorgeous to this guy who's only 15 years younger than her.
This is interesting because this plays into the Oedipal myth, because in some ways you could think, well, Oedipus just inherited her as his wife because she was the previous queen to the previous king.
Why do they have 4 children in 4 years then?
Yeah, there you go. I want to talk about that a little later, about the Freudian implications of what's going on.
He really, really loved her. So losing her is a catastrophe, even though it's got to be. He's devastated by the loss of this woman, mother of all his children. Then Creon allows him one last hug with his 2 younger children, who are little girls, which is heartbreaking.
Yes.
And then he does not go into exile at this point. It's left on this wonderful, dark question mark. He's allowed back into the house, like, we'll deal with you later.
Yes. Okay, I want to pause you there, Edith, because we'll come to that ending and where that leaves us. Let's talk about Oedipus, because earlier I think he used the word hubris. And I've read a lot about the question of, is this tragedy based on the faults in his character in some way, or is he punished completely unfairly? That's very bad luck, that he's simply ignorant of the truth of his identity through no fault of his own. His leadership qualities, in fact, lead him to unearth this, but that it was also predetermined. This was his destiny. He could not ever escape this fate. So is it a tragedy of fate or free will?
Yes and no.
Ha! It's a good question then.
I have actually been thinking about this for 40 years.
You're the right person to ask.
Yeah. And yes, it's predetermined, but his character is essential to the plot development. So look at it this way. If Oedipus had been an unquestioning and not particularly curious child in Corinth, he'd never have been worried by some rumour that he wasn't his parents' child and gone off on his own as a very young man, a very long journey to Delphi, alone on the road. You know, this is a world of brigands and cutthroats. If he hadn't been a very intelligent and slightly cocky individual, he wouldn't have just wandered into Thebes. Well, sorry. If he hadn't been somebody with a very short fuse, he wouldn't have kicked off.
The road rage.
Got road rage like that. He'd have just moved aside when the big chariot was coming past. He wouldn't have gone in and killed people because his manly dignity had been hurt. If he wasn't incredibly convinced of his own intelligence, he wouldn't have turned up at another city when it's got an incredible problem, when some monster is besetting it, and used his intelligence to answer the terribly difficult riddle which the monster had set. And if he hadn't been pretty self-confident, he wouldn't have married a woman 15 years older and just have ascended a throne and just taken charge. And if he hadn't been a man of obsessive need to track down the truth, he wouldn't have ever really bothered about this curse. He could have said to Jocasta, look, we've got plenty of money, let's go and live in another city which hasn't got a plague. I mean, he had a million choices along the way that would have meant he never discovered. So it could have been that he was fated to kill his father and married his mother, but that he never found out.
Yes.
Or that this is where Sophocles comes in, he was fated to kill his father and marry his mother, found out and decided, so what?
So the fact is that he would have killed his father. He did kill his father, and he married his mother, partly because of his own character, as you say, because he ended up in this road rage and then ended up attracted to Jocasta. But the play is also a result of his actions.
That's a very good way of putting it.
The play is not inevitable because he's the one driving the action.
Yeah, through his characters. So they are absolutely intertwined. He does have free will. He makes several decisions of his utterly own free will in the course of his life story.
On the other hand, he can't escape the prophecy of what was told he would do, and he did do, actually, can he? So we feel strongly that somehow fate is to blame, and he isn't to some degree.
Yes.
And this touches us, right? It feels, I don't know, unjust in some way, even though we can see his flaws and we might want to try and stop him and all that. But whatever his flaws, they're nothing proportional to what he suffers.
No. And I think it's very important to emphasize that in the ancient Greek world, there is a huge difference between killing your kinfolk and killing.
What is the difference?
You get this terrible thing called miasma or pollution if it's your own kin. Killing your own parents is, for the ancient Greeks, unconscionably bad, even if they've attacked you or something like that. That makes you utterly polluted, which Oedipus is. He is polluting Thebes. If he had killed in a fair fight just some bloke on the road, even a fairly unfair fight, if they weren't related, that might have been a legal crime, and it was, but it didn't send shivers of disgust and unease and almost supernatural terror.
There's a lot of this internecine bloodshed goes on in Greek tragedy, though, right?
Let me give you an example. So in the Athenian courts of law, there were different courts for murder, and if it was a family member, the court had no roof, and that was to protect the jurors from that pollution.
Oh, wow.
That's how strong, yeah. I think we can sense it with incest. We get an actual visceral, but I don't think we feel the same difference between homicide and kin homicide that the ancient Greeks did.
This fact that it is his fate and how little control he may have over that destiny which has already befallen him, so to speak, does this not touch in us some general fear that we cannot know or control our own futures? Is that part of what's so unsettling about this?
Of course it does. Of course it does. And the problem of fate versus free will, so the internal, external factors in determining our futures, is one that will always be with us. I should say, though, that in all of Sophocles, and in fact all of Greek tragedy, we have 30 Greek tragedies, this is the play that pushes the power of fate to its maximum because it was decreed before he was born. That's the simple fact. Most curses from the gods that something terrible will happen to you happen as a result of an action you chose. So Agamemnon sacrifices Iphigenia, so he is going to get it. He killed kin. If he hadn't sacrificed Iphigenia, he wouldn't have done. This one, Oedipus is actually, in one point of view, completely innocent.
Yes, because he was unaware before all this occurred.
Yeah.
We talked earlier about the enduring relevance in social and political terms as well. So there is a political interpretation of Oedipus's position and actions, isn't there, in addition to this personal one, about the nature of his position and actions as a leader that would have resonated in ancient Athens at the times as well, and perhaps does so today. Did it not?
Yes, it did, because we must remember that the audience watching it is the Athenian democratic citizen body who had executive power. The citizen majority vote had executive power every time. They didn't have representative democracy as we do, where we vote for congressmen or members of parliament to make decisions on our behalf. The Athenian citizens turned up themselves to huge open-air meetings and put their hands in the air to vote on every single important decision. Thebes, however, which was only 24 hours walk from Athens over the Kithaeron Mountains, the very mountain range where Oedipus was exposed as a baby, was a deadly enemy of the Athenian state. And that's because of two things. One is that it had actually betrayed its city to the Persians during the Persian Wars 50 years previously. Now, I always use this analogy. So if, say, Birmingham, which is 24 hours walk from London, if it had invited Hitler in to its helicopter pad in the war, We would never let the Birmingham people forget it. They would never be forgiven in the political record. Do you see what I mean? The Thebans had. Related to that, though, is that's because the Thebans were an oligarchy. 2 or 3 top families ran it. Always had. For hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, they had never had a democracy. They never would have a democracy. So that's why they let the Persians in, because they said to themselves, we'll just tell the Persians, who quite like appointing local sub-rulers, we'll just tell the Persians that we'll give them some taxes. Sure, we don't care. And moreover, they will defend us against Democrats. So the plays about tyranny, about despotic leaders, are usually set not in Athens. They're set in Thebes, because they actually were despotic families in Thebes.
Okay, so he's having a go at this autocratic rule.
Well, not just at the historical city of Thebes because it had Persianized, as they said, but because it represented a threat. The aristocrats in Athens, who would still like to get rid of the democracy, and they tried a couple of times, they had lots of friends. So this is a very political play.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier Oedipus Tyrannos. I mean, I believe the tyrant didn't mean exactly the same as now. It meant he had a legitimate claim, but it also has a meaning, I guess, a double meaning in this play anyway, because does he become a little bit tyrannical?
Yes. The word is actually at this very time in the 5th century shifting meaning. So that doubleness is inherent.
So that's deliberate.
It has a technical sense, which is not morally charged, which is that this is somebody who's come into power who is not the hereditary king.
But has a legitimate claim.
Well, has been almost voted in on a tide of popular support, installed as a tyrant. That is what that means originally. But in the 5th century, because people who are voted in on tides of popular support, and if they can't be got rid of after 4 years, and this has resonances at the moment.
I see where this is going, Edith.
People who try to change the law so that they can stay in power for longer and not have elections, those sorts of people tend to have what we call tyrannical dispositions, that they think they know best, they think that they're indispensable, they like being in charge, they get off on it, they're often narcissists.
One of the translations I saw, the chorus says something along the lines of arrogant self-love breeds absolute rule.
Yeah, now that arrogant self-love is actually the word hubris in the Greek.
Aha, right.
Hubris, phutue, tyrannon is the Greek. Hubris implants, phutue by nature, it means like in nature makes a tyrant.
Well, there's so many resonance echoes of this, aren't there?
It's actually scary how many there are at the moment.
It is. It's interesting how the balance between the individual story and the political has shifted as well, and it can in the way you present the play, presumably.
Yeah.
Because, when we think back to originally when the actors are in masks, it maybe has a more ceremonial kind of universal symbolic meaning, whereas in modern times we're more interested perhaps in the role and psychology of the individual. So both of these things, all these things are still going on, though, in this play 2,500 years ago.
Absolutely. And as I said, Sophocles had himself been a ruler of Athens because he was elected in. But he may even himself have reflected on how he enjoyed power or did not enjoy power. He may have looked at other rulers. So Pericles, for example, as I said, has been voted in every year for 30 years. Now, that must have begun to go to his head. Who knows?
So he can see maybe change is coming, actually, in the century he lived.
Yeah.
The emerging democracy of Athens.
But he studied in great depth what happens to people who are in power for very long. And he gives us a wonderful portrait in Oedipus of somebody who is beginning to think that only they can be right.
Yeah. Now, you talked earlier about religion as well, and I want to just touch on Jocasta and what her role is, in addition to the personal story, because she voices her skepticism throughout of the oracles very explicitly. So does she represent a challenge to the religious orthodoxy of ancient Athens, for example?
Up to a point, there were definitely people in the 5th century at this time, including a friend of Sophocles, who was a philosopher called Protagoras, who had already said, I don't actually think there are gods, or if there are gods, they don't involve themselves in human life.
Wow.
There were not atheists, but agnostic loud agnostic voices. I think that's happened because of the democracy, because we'd had a democratic revolution in 507, so that's about 25 years before Sophocles is born. And if you suddenly overthrow all the old aristocratic families who have said, like Charles I of England, that they had been appointed by God.
Yes, divine right.
Then if you overthrow them all, then I think it's inevitable that you start to question whether the gods that those guys said had appointed them truly existed, or at least truly had power.
But Jocasta herself challenges because she believes that they're just wrong.
Well, of course she does, because she believes that her baby who was supposed to kill, she was told as a very, very young woman, as an impressionable teenager, by Apollo's oracle, that she would have a son who would kill Laius and sleep with her. She had been told that.
Yeah, she believes her son has been killed, so this can't have happened.
There is no son to do that.
They've got to be wrong. But she seems to be consistently adopting that position, and why wouldn't she? As you say, it's a natural reaction. Very rational, generally. And actually, it's interesting in this production of Ella Hickson's adaptation at the Old Vic, Indira Varma, who plays Jocasta, this is very much emphasized. She is very consistent in attacking what she would think is the hocus pocus of prophecy and the religious establishment, essentially. I mean, that's an emphasis they've put on it, but it's there to some degree, is it?
It is. So in Sophocles' version, actually, when she gets really scared, just before the news finally breaks, she does pray to Apollo.
That's right, yes.
She does. So she's hedging her bets.
And of course, in the end, she probably has to accept that they were right.
Exactly. The Ella Hickson version, I thought, was unsatisfactory in that they made Creon head of a very strong evangelical cult, which is absolutely not in Sophocles.
No, because actually earlier, Oedipus has accused him of being ambitious and wanting his throne and all of that, which is absolutely not true. In the text, he goes to great lengths to say, I don't really want that power. I've got everything I like. Why would I want those responsibilities? But in the Old Vic production and the Hickson's version, he is not only a religious zealot, but he's clearly ambitious.
Well, I felt myself that was a rather clumsy attempt to make it modern and relevant, that this is somehow about evangelical Christians wanting to reassert power, or evangelicals of any religion.
In some way, though, the establishment does reassert itself.
Yes, it does, but there is no element of religious fanaticism in Sophocles' play. It's just not something he's interested in. And I felt that that version was trying to make a point about whether it's about the Taliban in Afghanistan or it's about the religious right in Texas. I felt that it took away the ambiguity about Creon. We actually don't know what's making him tick.
No. He generally acts pretty reasonably throughout, actually.
He does.
Let's talk about this moment of realization you touched on earlier for Jocasta, who realizes what's happening before Oedipus and doesn't tell him. It is the most horrible moment, and it's done quietly. You could miss it. And I thought, actually, in the Old Vic production, it wasn't as clear as it could have been.
No.
Because, as you say, she just takes herself off, but not before she pleads desperately with him not to pursue it further.
Yes.
Although, as if, could she live with it if he didn't?
It's quite brilliant. If you're playing Jocasta, you're an actor, you have to decide, actually. Sophocles leaves some ambiguity at the moment she twigs. There's no ambiguity with Oedipus because he's torturing this guy to get the information out of him. But with Jocasta, when she comes out and prays, could it be because she's twigged and is just trying to get some sort of favour in the gods to save the day at the last minute? When I read it, I feel she knows earlier.
Wow, okay.
The moment she sees it's inevitable that he will find out is when she goes off.
Yes, okay, that's a good point. And actually, I wanted to ask you about this. In Robert Icke's production, he stages this scene where Oedipus and Jocasta actually face the revelation of the truth of their relationship on the stage together.
Yeah. Which
does not exist in Sophocles' original in that way. And I wanted to ask you what you made of that choice in that scene.
Didn't like it. I'm sorry. I just have immense faith in Sophoclean stagecraft. I do not believe that either Robert Icke or Ella Hickson knows better than Sophocles.
Okay, fair enough. Actually, in the theater, it created the most electrifying scene because, as you can imagine, it's just horrific for them to share this moment of realization. And it just went on in silence for a minute, possibly, I don't know, more, where they can't process what this means. And as you said earlier, there are some versions where they would continue to live somehow.
Yes.
Well, they're processing all of that and realizing, I guess, no. There is no way out of this.
Well, I have no objection to any sort of modernisation or adaptation. And lots of people really like that production. You asked what my preference is.
I was just intrigued because I don't think I'd realized at the time I saw that how different it was from the original until I come back and read the original again.
Do you know what? This play was actually banned from the English stage for 150 years, precisely because it has an incestuous mother and son on stage at the same time. You could write a version, a neoclassical adaptation, where they both appeared, but not at the same time.
And actually, that's a great segue. Can we talk briefly about Freud and the Oedipal theory that's manifest in the play? He, of course, generalizes from this particular, I guess, but there are overt references to his idea expressed in the play. The scenario is such, but Oedipus is ignorant of it, right? So how does that qualify what's going on?
Well, the line that fascinated Freud and I think originated the whole thing, he saw a production of this play in France before he wrote the interpretation of dreams and all of that. He saw a production and he was electrified. At the moment when Oedipus tells Jocasta that
his father has died, who he thinks is his father, but there is still the possibility he could marry his mother.
Yes, exactly.
Because she's still alive. Merope, it's not his mother,
yeah.
But he still fears that's possible because he thinks she's his mother. She replies...
She says that many men have thought about sleeping with their mothers in their dreams.
Yes, many a man has suffered this before, but only in his dreams.
Yes.
And as you say, Freud heard this very line.
That line. And as Freud thought that the dreams were the royal road to the unconscious, his interpretation of dreams was named after an actual dream book from antiquity. We've got a dream interpretation handbook called Onero Critica, which means interpretation of dreams, by a professional dream interpreter called Artemidorus. It's from the Roman Empire, but we've got it. And do you know there are 17 different types of dream? Artemidorus records in his own clients about different positions you can sleep with your mother in dreams and what they mean.
Oh my God. Freud was not the first.
Freud heard that line in Sophocles, went off and found this ancient dream handbook and realised that many of this ancient dream critic's clients went to him with dreams about sleeping with their mothers that had made them anxious, which made him think it must be a universal transhistorical phenomenon if it was happening in ancient Greece. Therefore, all human males have an urge to sleep with their mothers that they have to repress.
It's interesting, of course, Oedipus in this play, as we said, he doesn't know that Jocasta is his mother. But, as you've said previously, they are in love and he's attracted to her. So there's maybe some subconscious substance in this. I don't know. He doesn't know that Laius is his father when he kills him. So he hasn't deliberately killed his father. However, he's taken the framework of this. And as you say, Jocasta alludes to it. There are many men who have dreamed this. Wow. Anyway, can we talk about the ending of the play? We talked earlier about the fantastic description of Oedipus and Jocasta in the palace and Oedipus coming out and he's blinded himself. And we have this symbol of blindness with Tiresias. The prophet was blind but saw everything. And now Oedipus sees the truth and is now blind. But also, I wanted to ask you about what happens thereafter. He comes out, he's blind, he wants to leave. Oedipus wants to leave, and I presume purges the city in so doing. But Creon doesn't let him go. And says he needs to consult the oracle as to what to do with him, and brings him back inside. Now, the devil's disciple, after all this fantastic stuff that's gone on, they have this sort of little debate, and Creon's dithering a bit. Doesn't that feel a bit anticlimactic? We're left with no decision about what happens to him. And even having this little debate seems anticlimactic after the fireworks of what's gone on. Am I wrong?
I don't find it anticlimactic at all. I find it wonderfully ambiguous because it ends on a ... to be continued. That is also, I think, one of the more realistic moments when people are in incredible shock. Everybody's in incredible shock at this point. Creon has got 1,000,001 things on his mind. He's suddenly going to have to become father figure to 4 children. He's got to bury his sister, who we have no reason to believe he didn't adore. And he's got to somehow or other get that city back under control. I mean, there's lots of people dying. People are going to be incredibly shocked. People may come and try and lynch the palace. They might try and lynch Oedipus. If you try to put yourself in Creon's shoes, he will absolutely have called for calm and said, we need to think about this and get guidance from the oracle that has been proven to be right all along.
Okay, yeah. It's a sort of reestablishment of order in that sense, that he's going to consult the oracle, and so the oracle is still to be believed because it was right. There's also this sense from the chorus, who make a sort of pronouncement, philosophical pronouncement about Oedipus's fate, that all generations of men amount to nothing. Your life amounts to nothing. And they talk about time. Time sees all. Everything will out. Evil and transgression will out. It's a sort of pretty nihilistic perspective, ultimately, that the chorus expresses. Is that fair?
I don't think it's nihilistic. I think it's
realistic.
Realistic and wonderful wisdom of the ancient Greeks. They were prepared to stare the full horror that is the human condition full in the face in a way that the great monotheisms don't. They offer you this hope of a happy afterlife if you're a good person. For the Greeks, the underworld is this horrible place that nobody wants to go. You're just a mere dark, miserable, sunless shadow for eternity. But the Greeks stared that in the face, and it's one of the reasons I find them so attractive, is that they don't peddle fictions about possible blissful afterlives.
No. But then they say, how can a mortal man be happy? It's not very encouraging to the time man has in his life.
I have no problem with it.
That's it. That's the reality. Okay. Edith, thank you so much. It's been great talking to an expert about this play. Before I let you go, however, you may recall that one of the traditions of the podcast, I like to ask my guests to recommend another play that we might cover in the podcast, or one that you just personally love. And last time, I think you chose The Birds by Aristophanes, possibly as an antidote to Greek tragedy. Have you got another choice to recommend to our listeners today?
Today, I'm going to have to stick with Sophocles because I saw a superb production last night of Sophocles' Electra.
Ah, yes.
That is in the same translation volume as the Oxford World's Classics that you mentioned earlier. It's with Oedipus and Antigone. So if you buy that book, you get 3 plays.
Yep.
But the production last night reminded me how the character of Electra, who is as obsessed as Oedipus is, as defiant, as angry with the gods, as angry and as blighted by fate. She's primarily motivated not by terror of what's going on, but by revenge. It's a different motivation, but it's another titanic, overpowering personality, amazing poetry, very dark about fate, and with a similar unsettling ending.
Yes, and a wonderful chorus.
The production had a wonderful chorus. It was an outstanding production, to my mind, in a wonderful version, very close to the Greek, by the poet Anne Carson. And she, like me, has huge faith in Sophocles' structure and doesn't mess with it.
Okay, so stick with Sophocles, as Edith recommends. Thank you for that. So you have still got a couple of options. You can see Sophocles in London. Electra and Oedipus continues at the Old Vic Theatre in London until the 29th of March. Thank you so much, Edith. Great to see you again. As the curtain falls on the devastated Oedipus, is his defeat proof that he was doomed from the start, a victim of an inescapable fate? Do we then succumb to the proposition that our future can be preordained? There are many who believe that the dispensation of good and evil in our lives is attributable to a power beyond our understanding. Others who trust that it is our own character that determines our destiny, just as Oedipus brought his fate upon himself because of the type of person that he was. There are, of course, external forces in our own lives that we cannot influence. But even if circumstances conspire against us, it is difficult to give up on the faith that how we choose to respond can affect the outcome of our lives. This is the irreconcilable mystery and challenge of being human. Thanks for listening. See you next time. There are additional footnotes about this and every other play that we cover in the podcast available to our patrons. Patrons also enjoy early access to our sister podcast, The Play Review, in which Jody Rylett and I share our views on current productions on the London stage. To become a patron, please visit our website at theplaypodcast.com. And don't forget to follow us wherever you listen to podcasts so as not to miss an episode. Thank you again for listening. See you next time.